The race for the playoffs is on, and Winnipeg is surprisingly closer to clinching its playoff destiny more than you think. Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, it is all about the race for the playoffs, and for the Jets, that's not really in question, but for a lot of the teams that we are, going to be seeing over the next couple of weeks, some of them will be fighting for the division lead, some of them will be fighting for their own playoff destinies, some of them are already well out of the race, and so it's time to check in and see how our respective conferences are doing. This time we're going to start off with the West. This one of the two conferences I feel is absolutely the strongest, especially post-trade deadline. The Central Division in particular has really loaded up. The Jets, are one of the, few Central teams that's really fighting for a playoff run that really didn't acquire too much at the deadline. Not for lack of trying from what it sounds like, but ultimately, the Jets came up short on the Brock Nelson thing, and so that now has a bit of a tangible impact because, unfortunately, it was the Avs that walked away with Brock instead. But for the Central, right now, we're looking at Winnipeg, Dallas, and Colorado anchoring those top three spots. And Winnipeg has an 8-point margin right now, but Dallas has 2 games in hand. So assuming that the Stars do, in fact, win those 2 games, that would give the Jets a 4-point cushion, which right now is really not looking too safe, right? Now, I think for the Jets, they're going to be fine for competing for this Central Division crown. I just think in terms of safe, I mean, it's just one of those things where, the Jets really need to keep up their current form because the Stars are very much hot on their heels. Both of these teams have very similar records in their last 10 games. Dallas is just very slightly better, 8-2-0, and the Jets are 6-3-1. So it's going to be a bit of a dogfight. I think that's why Friday's game really has a lot of potential for Winnipeg to potentially put Dallas really a little bit further back in the Central than they can essentially gain ground on. If you take that 4-point swing, that's a really big deal if you are trying to win the Central. And for the Jets, that's really imperative. Right behind Dallas is Colorado, and you absolutely 100% are rooting for both Dallas and Colorado to play in the first round. One of these teams knocking each other out is literally a huge bracket booster for the Jets. I know I talked a lot about the trade deadline not really going super well for Winnipeg. Honestly, one of the Stars and Avs being out early, and in my personal preference, probably the Avs, that's kind of like getting a huge acquisition at the trade deadline because suddenly you are not going to be competing with one of these crazy teams. It already looks like Rantanen is fitting in relatively well with the Stars, and Nelson has had a couple of early contributions for Colorado. But, I think the biggest thing with the Avs is that they've just overhauled their entire roster. Everything from the goaltending to their center depth, to even, the prime winger. Rantanen going to Carolina, Nietzsche's coming back. Obviously Rantanen's now back in division, but this is a very different team than when we last saw them. We haven't even seen the Jets versus Nietzsche's yet, and that top line for Colorado has been cooking. So if there is any hope of the Stars getting through round one, especially with, right now they're going to have home ice advantage, I think that is a huge thing. I really think that you are rooting for this threesome to stay in the exact order it is. Dallas at home with an early advantage for the chance to put Colorado behind the 8 ball early, I think is a really, really big deal. So I don't want to say that we're rooting for Dallas necessarily, but we're kind of rooting for Dallas. The Pacific Division, a little bit less competitive in some ways. I mean, in terms of the quality of teams, I feel like we're not really looking at as many cup contenders here. The standings are relatively close, so they're competitive in that way. But if we're talking about elite teams, right, it's all in the Central, right? The Pacific is okay, and I think Vegas is probably the team that we're all kind of keeping a little bit of an eye on. They didn't make any crazy trades at the deadline, but they're still just one of those teams that when they get to the playoffs, they continue to be a huge pain in the butt. And after a bit of a rough patch a couple of weeks ago, they've started to stabilize their form. They're 7-2-1 in their last 10. And with the Oilers in kind of a bit of a free fall, that has given them some real incentive to essentially firm up their place at the top of the Pacific. Now, they're only 5 points ahead, but I think with Edmonton and LA really failing to gain a lot of ground recently, I think Vegas is in a pretty good spot to win the division. Less ideal for the Jets in some ways, but there is a chance that if the current standings hold, Vegas could face Minnesota in the first round. And I feel like that's actually not the worst for the Jets. I think obviously Vegas is going to advance, but Minnesota kind of softening up and beating up the Knights a little bit is probably about as good of a gift as you're going to get. I think for the most part, when you look at the other available matchups, this is probably the one that I think gives the Jets a real chance, because otherwise, if Calgary somehow won on an insane heater and Minnesota got stuck maybe in the second wild card, I wouldn't really imagine that the Flames would be a particular threat to the Knights, right? It's basically Wolf and a couple of other young players and some veterans, but there's not a lot there to really put Vegas under a lot of stress. And I'm not going to sit here and say that the Wild are a particularly tough opponent in your first round either, but comparatively speaking, if you want somebody that's going to play some real ground and pound hockey and make life very difficult and annoying for the Knights, probably your best hope is Minnesota. So for the Jets, I think that this is probably a pretty nice scenario. I'd like one of Edmonton and LA to knock each other out. I would think that the Oilers survive that series. I think Edmonton has the ability to sort out what's been going wrong. The goaltending for them recently has been atrocious, and I feel like, the team itself has just been sort of mired in a bit of a funk. Not a great time for them to have this happen if you're an Oilers fan. For LA, they play that really stingy, annoying hockey. And that is, for me, one of those really dicey things when it comes to the Jets, because Winnipeg can play well against low-scoring teams, but if it's a really strong defensive unit, that's where they've had a few problems in the past. So I think for the most part, the most ideal scenario is round one, Winnipeg gets one of Calgary or Vancouver, potentially an outside shot of it being St. Louis if the Blues end up sorting things out as well. I would prefer not to play the Blues. I think either of Calgary or Vancouver is a little more favorable. The Blues are not a hard team to beat, and I don't really worry about the Jets facing them. But St. Louis in general has been stingier, and they've started to turn it around under Montgomery. So Montgomery getting them back into a postseason spot would be a little bit of a problem for the Jets. They play a physically aggressive style. We know that their games are always close. I would not survive a 7-game series of that in the first round. So something to keep an eye on. But it really says a lot that, the Central Division teams are really pushing. Even the bottom of the Central is really pushing, further up and closer to those wild card spots. It's a really tight race. And, for the Jets, it's nice that they had such a good early run, because this is the time of year where that margin is really helping Winnipeg. And, they're really on a good track to potentially win not only the Central Division, but they're still on pace to win the President's Trophy. Now, Washington does still have a game in hand on the Jets, and the Caps continue to win lots and lots of games. They are tied in points, and they have a slightly better points percentage. So that game upcoming between Winnipeg and Washington in Winnipeg is going to be potentially a President's Trophy deciding game. So that should be something to keep an eye out for over the next couple of weeks. But of course, I did shout out the Caps. Let's chat a little bit about the Eastern Conference in just a brief moment. But before we do, did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories, and even who's cutting down the nets. As a Maryland fan, this is not going to be my year, I guess. But for a lot of you who are all about some of the biggest teams in college basketball, this is your best chance to win. Obviously, just a cheeky little $5 bet. And if you get maybe a score prediction right, maybe you get some player predictions right, a fantastic way to win. You can also be sure to use same game parlays to multiply your winnings and get even more out of March Madness. So visit FanDuel.com to get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about really the race for the playoffs. And for most teams, they have more or less cemented their status, but there are a number of squads that are still kind of in the hunt, looking for some sort of clarity over the next couple of weeks. And I feel like that is especially true in the East, where we've had some interesting late resurgences out of teams that have maybe come a little bit of a surprise to folks who haven't been following that conference closely. But for those who have maybe been looking at some of the underlying numbers for some of these teams, it was really a matter of time. In the Atlantic, I think the Atlantic is probably one of the more curious divisions because I feel like on paper, there's a lot to like with their top three teams in the Panthers, the Leafs, and the Lightning. But if you ask me which of these teams I actually think is a true cup threat and contender, I really look at the Lightning. I think, the Panthers are very good, but obviously they just lost Ekblad for like 20 games thanks to suspension. So that's going to have a sizable impact on potentially where they finish the season. Ekblad's still very good and still a big part of that blue line. So definitely not a small-time loss for them. Toronto, for their part, is a curious squad. I feel like they have quietly had a strong season, but every time I hear from their fans and stuff, I get the sense that there's just something a little bit boring about their gameplay. Craig Berube hockey is, a bit low event at times. And it's funny because, offensively, they've scored a fair few number of goals. They have one of the better team offenses in the East, but they're not putting up, dominant, crazy numbers like they were a couple of years ago back when their top six was just eating teams alive. So Toronto is definitely a team that feels like it's going to have a pretty decent playoff run, but I don't know if I really favor them to go too deep. I will say that Craig Berube's hockey does, I guess, lend itself to playoff stuff. If you're thinking about conservative hockey, I don't know if that's going to be that fun to watch, but hey, to each their own. Tampa, though, that's the one that really overhauled their middle six. Bjorkstrand and Gord coming in. That's a really big change. Tampa, I feel like, is one of those teams where if they get on a real big hot streak to end the season, that could be a really big threat to the rest of the Eastern Conference picture. They're definitely one of the teams that's now in the Cup favorite conversation. I don't think that they are the, quote, end quote, best team in the East, but they're darn near close. So they have a venomous offense. They are scoring at will. And if they can figure out how to put it all together on a consistent basis, they have quietly one of the top goal differentials in the league. So a very scary team if they get out of the first round or two. Out in the Metro, you've got, of course, the Caps at the top, which is no surprise. Washington has kind of been like, I guess, Jets East, although I would say their 5v5 offense is better in some ways. They do tend to concede more, though, because the Jets have Hellebuyck in net, and while Logan Thompson is technically in the conversation for Vezina, he is not really on the same level. So Hellebuyck, truly a special season from him. But the Caps, after having a bit of a rough couple of weeks, they've now reeled off 5 straight wins. Probably happy timing for them because Carolina has also hit a bit of a 5-game winning streak. The Canes in the Rantanen aftermath have been trying to figure things out. Seems like they're slowly piecing things back together. But the Canes, man, I really think that they were expecting the whole Nietzsche's trade to end better than it did. And now they've got a bit of a gap in their top 6. So that may not be a problem right now in the regular season, but I think once you get to the playoffs, that could start to make its presence a little more apparent. I know that Stankoven is a nice pickup for them, so he's no slouch, and I think that that's a really big add to their middle 6 and eventual top 6. But Rantanen, Nietzsche's, these guys are sort of top line finishers. Stankoven a little bit less so, more perhaps in the years to come. Finally, you've got the Devils, and the Devils are just really hanging on by a thread at this point. If there were better teams in the bottom of the Metro, they probably would have fallen more into a wild card now. With Jack Hughes sidelined for the year, you're missing Hamilton for the next few weeks. they're just beat up. Every year they seemingly are cursed with something that goes wrong, and I feel like the injury situation in New Jersey is real rough this year. So really tough to be a Devils fan. I don't know what you do with that team. They have come close in some ways, but it still feels like no matter the big blockbuster swings that they've made, which really it's just been the Meyer trade recently, it hasn't really panned out, and I feel like they're afraid to do more. So if you're a Devils fan, I wish you the best of luck. It might not be a long playoff run this year. In the wild card, you've got Ottawa and Columbus. And Columbus, I think, is probably one of the most heart rending or heart-touching, heartfelt stories of the NHL this year. Obviously, in the wake of the Gaudreau incident and his passing, I didn't know how this team was going to react. I mean, you lost one of your star young players and a guy who was such a heart and soul of this core. And it just seems like the room has really come together. The team under Evason has really been putting up some really good offensive numbers. And, their goal differential isn't great. It's just a +4. But you think about a team that last year was looking to really tank basically and has been sort of in the bottom, quarter of the NHL for years now. You really can't help but feel happy for the guys. I think if ever there was a team that you're kind of quietly rooting for to do well, it's probably Columbus. It seems like they're going to be a real tough out in the first round. I don't know that they're slated to go beyond that, but you know what? For a team that walked into the season with tragedy and, even before all of the Gaudreau stuff, probably very limited expectations, they have, defied so many odds, and they remain a really touching story. And I hope that they continue to have a Cinderella season in the playoffs. Ottawa, they have finally started to turn things around. For a while, their underlying numbers were good, but for some reason, either the PK or the goaltending or injuries were basically putting this team behind the 8 ball. I don't quite, know if it's maybe a Travis Green thing so much, but I feel like the Sens have sort of underperformed my expectations for them. Seems like they've started to put 2 and 2 together though recently, and if they start getting on a hot streak, especially now that they have Dylan Cousins in place of Josh Norris, and Cousins seems to be fitting in nicely early, that could be a big change for this team. Cousins, if he's finally free of the Sabres and he's really starting to, get things going, that could be a really big deal. So watch out for the Sens. They are one of the most intriguing wildcard teams I've seen in some time. I really feel like they have potential to be a menace in the playoffs, but it'll be interesting to see if they keep fighting, maybe even a little bit further for perhaps as high as the number 3 seed in the Atlantic. That really isn't out of the question, even if 5 points is a bit of, decent bit of ground to have to make up. On the fringes of these combos, you've got Montreal, New York, Boston, and Detroit. I don't really feel like any of these teams are particularly great, but if maybe the Rangers suddenly turn things around and get back into a playoff convo, that could be a thing. I don't know that anyone is really hoping that the Rangers make it at this point, unless you're a New York fan. I feel like their time has kind of come and gone with this core. And, with a lot of the departures and the loss of Fox, I just feel like this team really isn't, going anywhere. So it might be better just to go for maybe a quiet, soft little tank. They're not going to get to the lotto picks, but you know what? They can still walk away with something in the upper half of the first round. Montreal is kind of interesting. They concede a lot, but they have been able to round into form over the past couple of weeks. A 6-3-1 record in your last 10 is pretty decent. But they were a team that was probably expected to sell a little bit more. I just view them as, one of those teams where if they make the playoffs, it's going to be very much a one and done kind of thing. I don't really feel that there's a lot that's compelling about the way they play. And I don't get the sense that the Habs are a serious playoff threat. If they make it, anything can happen, but I would probably look at them in a less favorable light than I am the Blue Jackets right now. I think Columbus is playing, more consistently strong hockey. I guess there is technically the argument that Detroit could also turn things around, but the Red Wings for me are just bad. I feel like, this 6-game losing streak is maybe not, the fairest reflection of their talent, but I just don't see them as a particularly strong team. So, the Yzer plan had a couple of weeks where things looked like they were turning around, but eventually the trend, being your friend, does tend to catch up. And I think for Detroit, they're just an average squad. I mean, they're not the worst team I've ever seen, but I don't really watch them and feel like I'm seeing inspired hockey. So I think for the most part, this playoff picture is likely to stay relatively solidified. Columbus maybe being the one exception. We'll see if they can make it. Would be a great story if they hang on. They've played really good hockey this year. They've scored a lot of goals, and I feel like their top six is really starting to find some real cohesion, and their back end has relatively found at least a bit of a stable performance for the most part, even if the goaltending is still, not so great. But a lot of fun, a lot of interesting stuff. Amidst all of this, there's sort of a question of when the Jets might clinch, and it's not necessarily imminent, but we'll chat about a couple of, I guess, milestones for Winnipeg and how many games they technically need to win based on the current picture and absent of anyone else winning or losing games in order to get a couple of different spots. Those winning magic numbers are not as big as you might think, so we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Indeed. You just realized your business needed to hire somebody yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy, just use Indeed. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed's sponsored jobs put your jobs post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. I've personally used Indeed when I was looking for work myself many years ago. Their resume builder, super easy, super convenient, very fast, very comprehensive. And when I started searching for jobs, it immediately pulled up positions that were not only relevant to my work experience, my domains of expertise, but also my salary requirements. So if you're a hirer looking for top candidates, this has to be one of the easiest ways to do it. Super fast, instantaneous results, and now you can speed up your hiring process even more with the $75 sponsored job credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on the Locked On Winnipeg Jets podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, Indeed is all you need. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us as we are just closing out with some thoughts on Winnipeg really being closer to clinching a playoff spot than not at this point. I'm looking at playoffstatus.com, and I'm looking at the Western winning magic numbers. We're in week 24 of 29, and with the Jets where they are right now, you know what? The clinching numbers are looking pretty darn good. Now, these winning magic numbers are not indicative of how many they actually have to win. It's just absent of anyone else doing anything. Here's how many you need to absolutely, mathematically clinch a specific playoff seed. So if they wanted to clinch the 8th seed, all they need is 6 more wins, and they are guaranteed a playoff spot. Yes, it's a second wildcard spot. Not great. And again, I want to stress this is absent of any additional changes to the standings from other teams. So obviously any combination of wins and losses for certain teams that are fighting for these seeds would lower that number even more. So I think sometime either early next week or maybe towards the end of next week, we might be able to see a little bit of an X next to Winnipeg's name. If they want the number 7 seed, that's just one more win right now. And if they want to start talking about, the Central Division clinching scenarios, they need 9 wins for the 3rd spot clinched, 10 wins for the 2nd spot. And if they want to win the Central, it is 15 wins. So some combination that allows you to, make up that difference of 30 points. You get the Central Division title. And I think it's probably going to be one of those scenarios where they do need more of those wins than not. Dallas has really been cooking pretty strongly lately. The Avs are not really close, I would say, but they are gaining ground. So it's going to be hard to put yourself completely out of distance. The Avs are pretty much not capable of clinching the first, but they can cut into Winnipeg's lead if, maybe they win one of the upcoming matchups or they start to chunk out some points from other teams. So there's real scenarios here where I think the Jets get the Central title. Maybe, I guess you'd probably be looking more at like very early April. That's closer to the end of the season. I think, it's probably going to come down to the wire. I just don't see the Stars having a late season collapse. They've been too good recently. I think it's going to be all the way down to the last couple of games. And I think these upcoming games against Dallas are really going to decide who does win the Central. And honestly, for the Jets, it could even have an impact on their President's Trophy race. But absent of anything else, 15 wins to win the Central. That's pretty amazing. The fact that we're at 94 points already is super impressive. Hellebuck and the power play have really gotten the Jets to an amazing record. They're not going to get all 30 points here. Like, don't get me wrong, and they won't need all 30 either. So keep that in mind. But I'm feeling really good about this. I think, with the Jets having currently an 8-point lead, again, 2 games in hand for Dallas, but they're not guaranteed to win either of those. Winnipeg, that early lead that they built, like I said earlier, was such a big deal. So next week, I think the Jets do clinch a playoff spot. I think it's close. If it's not next week, it might be the following week, very early. I don't think it's going to take that much more for Winnipeg to do it. That 6-win margin with some of the other opponents possibly dropping games in those wild card spots. I think the Jets are cooking with gas. I think they're really close. And, for my expectations, I really do think the Jets get through the first round. I don't really have any particular concerns about that unless somebody gets hurt. If there's an injury, a really serious one, that is kind of a different conversation. But so far, I don't think that we have to worry about that. The second round is where I start to have some questions. If either of Dallas or Colorado is the opponent, that's going to be a tough one. And I think it's really imperative for the Jets to win the Central this year so that they make sure Dallas and Colorado, one of those teams is coming off the board. If the Jets fall into second or third in the Central, which again is really not likely, but is technically possible, it very much changes my outlook on their overall playoff run. But again, I'm not really worried about that right now. I don't see that really happening. I would be shocked if something like that does transpire. I just can't really envision a scenario where it does happen, but stranger things have occurred before. Like I said, though, I'm not going to stress about that right now. I don't think it's all that likely. And, for the Jets, they've built up such a nice cushion for themselves to where even when they stumbled a couple weeks ago, or now it's probably been a couple of months, they still had enough of a margin to where, once they got back to winning, things would look pretty good. So I'm pretty happy with this. Would love to know how y'all are feeling about the playoff picture. Winnipeg is feeling pretty good. They've got a 20% chance of facing the Flames in the first round, an 18% chance potentially of an Avs matchup. I think the Colorado one for me is relatively unlikely as of right now, just because the Stars are still playing really well. If the Stars start to stumble, maybe that could be a really nice advantage for the Jets. But I do think that, Colorado and Dallas are likely to play each other first. Looking at it, I think the Stars have a 46% chance of playing Colorado in the first round. And I would really be rooting for them to do it at home. I think if they have to go on the road against Colorado, that's going to be a lot harder. So never been a Stars fan, but I guess for the next couple of weeks, I am vaguely rooting for them in a sort of abstract way, right? Where we're, going with they may not be your friend and they may be an enemy, but a friend or I guess an enemy of your enemy is a potentially useful asset. So that is how I'm going with it. Curious to know what you think it's going to take for the Jets to clinch. Do you think they do it next week, or do you think they do it in the week after? Drop your predictions below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening. As always, we will talk about some more Jets stuff and probably preview coverage ahead of Winnipeg versus Dallas tomorrow. But like I said, that's all the time that we've got for tonight. Thanks for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.